Woo! The Golden Stallion here for you for another little, well, you know what it is. It's not another little anything, actually. I promised this on this week's Q&A that I was supposed to do it in the main episode of Sovereign Tech, never got to it for time constraints and all that. And instead of having it take up any time in, what was it going to be, episode 206 of Sovereign Tech or episode 207? I lose track. I said that I would do a history of Christmas, or the reality around Christmas, because, well, as we will explore, Christmas is really a borrowing of a certain holiday, perhaps. Now, I've told this story briefly in the past. Anytime really that a holiday comes up, I've talked about it on Sovereign Tech. When we talk about Christmas, I talked about, of course, Saturnalia, but it goes much deeper than that. And we need to talk about it, okay? But when it comes to Valentine's Day, we talk about the Lupercalia, or when it's, when it's Easter. Well, that's a whole different ballgame. Easter gets into, oh man, the things. Well, I mean, of course, Passover, and then it goes much beyond that. In reference to Ishtar, a very different holiday. But if you've never heard me debunk the arguments against, because there's this idea, I'll mention this, I'll give you this one real briefly, okay, because this lie got spread on the internet pretty hard, okay? We'll talk about Easter Fest, and then we're going to we're going to start talking about what Christmas is really all about. Woo! Because the Golden Stallion, as I always say, I'm a gamer first, a historian second, a tech journalist third. Look where historian sits. It's above tech journalist. So I get to get into some history with you, and that's very exciting for me. Anyway, Easter. What Easter is really all about is, a lot of people have talked about over the years, and it is so simple to kind of put these two words together. It's, wait a minute, Easter, Ishtar. Easter, Ishtar. Now, Ishtar, of course, is a Sumerian or Assyrian goddess, one of the most prominent. And in fact, if you want to know much of the story of Ishtar, you can actually you can go to audiooftheancients.xyz. You can go to, I have a Bandcamp page, and I did a dramatic reading of the descent of Ishtar, which covers a lot of her story and her relationship with Dumuzi, her husband. And anyway, you can check that out if you want. audiooftheancients.xyz. We'll take you right to that, and you can buy a copy of me performing that. But that's not. I'm not here to sell you an album or anything, okay? So Ishtar is this very famous goddess. I mean, and we could spend a whole episode talking about the importance of Ishtar, which I'm not going to do. But effectively, she is a goddess that has to do with fertility, rebirth, also war, and other things. Easter being an appropriated holiday. Okay, and this happened a lot throughout Christianity, and that's some of what we're going to break into here. Okay, Easter being an appropriated holiday, from the pagans into, Catholicism or Christianity in general, and that of course deserves some exploration as well. The argument goes that Easter can't be Ishtar because the word Ishtar would have skipped entire languages and cultures. And it's an interesting argument, and people say, "Look, this is the very simple proof that couldn't have happened." There's no way that, because what happened is that they say, well, the word Easter actually comes from Eostar, which is kind of a Gaelic or Norman word. It comes out of England, more of ancient England, we should say. And so, how did the word Ishtar get all the way up to England? Well, I could debunk it just through that, but that gets into some degree of speculation. Why bother with the speculation? Why not just prove straight up, and I've said this so many times because I love to say this because I am so annoyed at how many people bought into the idea that, oh no, actually, Easter has nothing to do with Ishtar. Well, here it is. Very simple. You ready for the word? Here's your modern word, okay? Because again, that's the argument, is that Easter is a modern word, Ishtar is an ancient word, and it skipped. It skipped, somehow, or that it's not possible that Ishtar could have skipped entire cultures, lands, continents, generations, whatever. Okay, ready? Here's your English word that's going to prove that argument dead wrong, that, that Ishtar and Easter aren't related. Paper. Paper. It's that simple. Where does the word paper come from? It comes from the word papyrus. Where does the word papyrus come from? Now, paperism is definitely a very modern word, even more modern than Easter. Okay, where did the word, but papyrus is an ancient word. Where did that come from? It came from Egypt. That's what, because it came from, papyri, which is effectively what, the Egyptians would write on. Okay, so papyrus somehow turned into paper. And you can see the relation. It's a very simple relation. In many ways, it's even more direct than Ishtar and Easter, but because of the function. So, how did everybody just start calling after Egypt? Did everybody start calling what they wrote upon? Did they call it something based off papyri? No, because what did you call paper in Rome? In Latin, you called it Carta, as in the Magna Carta, right? And, well, shit, how did Carta get all the way up to fucking Britain, right? Because that's the Magna Carta? Well, then that kind of proves my other point, is that you can see how these words would have traveled, because the Roman Empire went to Britain, and they carried a lot of this very, ancient paganism and, a lot of these ancient religions and ancient terms and ancient cultures along with them. So, of course, the word Easter, could in some form or fashion have come from Ishtar. Anyway, point being is that paper is a word based upon a very ancient word that skipped continents, generations. I mean, it skipped everything. So the argument that, well, Easter can't be Ishtar because the words aren't related is horseshit. Or, because they're disconnected from each other for certain centuries or through certain cultures or whatever. That's nonsense. No, we have tons of words that have done that over and over and over again. That argument is ridiculous. So whenever somebody, now, I know I have Christian listeners, and I love you. Okay, now you could say that, well, fine, maybe it's an appropriation or something, but really, it has more of a connection with Passover, or maybe you're going to say that, well, we got to celebrate it at some point, and so we just so happen to choose that day. Fine, but just keep in mind that, yes, okay, Ishtar and Easter are a thing. Now, I mean, I could turn this whole thing about Easter, I could spend an entire hour just talking about that, because you have to get into what is the nature of Catholicism, what is the nature of Christianity, primitive Christianity and things like this. And we might get into that in a bit when we are talking about Christmas here, because it's relevant. Okay, but I don't want to spend all that time on Easter. I want to get into Christmas, the time that is relevant, a holiday that seemingly everybody across the world, even if you're not Christian, celebrates. Even if you're Jewish, I'm ethnically Jewish. I grew up in a Jewish family, of course, later converted to Christianity, but I grew up in Judaism, and even we, not exactly would celebrate Christmas. I mean, it was a confusing thing because it's so goddamn prevalent. It's such a big deal. So I think it's important to talk about where the hell did this come from? What is it all about? Because as I would hope, I'm giving the ending away. It doesn't have anything to do with Christ. And so let's break into it. So why don't we start at the beginning? When was the first Christmas ever really celebrated? Well, the first one that we actually know of a Christmas being celebrated was in Rome, and it was in 336. Okay, that would be 336 CE. That's a conversation in itself. In fact, it's one I plan on having on Sovereign Tech here in the near future. I think we have a real calendar problem. I agree with a lot of people. There's been people since really the 90s. Well, I think we also have a math problem. I think we have a language problem. That's why I bring up E prime. That's why I bring up, base 12 math and all these different things. Okay, I think we have all kinds of problems, and we can get over them. But anyway, in the 90s, there was this concept called the Holocene era, or called the Holocene calendar, or it'd be HE, what they actually call the human era. And pretty much what they do is they tack on 10,000 to the years that you have now. And it goes back, the history of the Holocene era, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it now, goes back to what is effectively, like the first temple that we have sort of in recorded history getting built. And that would have been, around 8,000 BCE. And so they tack on 10,000. And the reason they do this is to make it very easy to, this idea of the Holocene calendar is to make it very easy to, to think back of when certain things happened and all this, throughout history. And it is, I think for a lot of people, it can be very confusing to talk about, CE and BCE, like, okay, wait, so I have to start counting backwards once I get to, once I get beyond 1 CE, like how exactly does that work? What's this year zero? There's all kinds of problems with this, right? So I really dig the idea of the Holocene calendar if you've never looked into it. It's something that seems to be getting some degree of popularity because, people are saying that when you have, when you say what's the year, like right now, the year is 2016, and when you hear this, it might be 2017, but when you hear this, it's 2016, but that seems like that inherently, not inherently, well, I shouldn't say inherently, but it could consciously or unconsciously remove, some odd 10,000 years of human history, if not more. And it kind of ignores it, and I think there is something to that unconscious, concept of, only thinking of history in the past 2,000 years, say. And of course, what is that break based upon? It's based upon the birth of Christ. And that's problematic because, well, first off, even from a Christian perspective, I think it's problematic because guess what? Christ wasn't born in 1 AD, as you would call it, Anno Domini, not after death. I'm always amazed when people think it means that. Okay, he was not born in 1 AD or 1 CE, okay, or 10,001 HE. Woo! He was born likely in either 4 or 8 BCE. That's based upon, the rule of Herod and a lot of different other factors. That's the guess. Okay. Now, also, understand this, and this segues nicely into starting off talking about Christmas. Like we said, the first one that we know of was celebrated in 336 CE, or if you want to go with the Holocene calendar, 10,336 HE. I love that. Anyway, that's the first one that we know of when it was done. And look, you got to understand that there were arguments that while that's the first Christmas celebrated, that's not the first time that people were arguing when exactly was Christ born, because that's what Christmas is supposed to be all about, right? December 25th, that's when Christ was born. And, you have arguments from a lot of the, what would be the ante-Nicene fathers, okay, the kind of the church fathers at the time. And let's break this down a little bit, is that at the time, and this, a lot of people might want to turn me off as soon as I say this, but look, I think it's as I do have a doctorate of divinity. So as a religious scholar, that's when you hear Dr. Brian Sovereign, that's what it's for. As a religious scholar, okay, I am of the opinion that the original church is the Catholic Church, and that in fact the only church today, like the really, the one church that can actually claim to really be Christianity is Catholicism. I've said that on Sovereign Tech Prime episodes before, so it shouldn't be anything new. If you are not a Catholic and you are a Christian, rock and roll. Your opinion differs from mine, okay? And maybe you think, your divine messages differ from mine, and I would agree because I don't get divine messages. But there you go, okay? Go ahead and you keep doing what you do. I'm just saying, my opinion on the matter. Okay, so at the time, I would say that there was only Catholicism. Now, I shouldn't say that there was only, this is, again, this Christian history is such a convoluted subject. I love talking about it, believe it or not, okay? But you have the Waldensians, like how long had the Waldensians been around? Did they really just start, a few hundred years after the birth of Christ, or were they always there and they were just kind of the keepers of the primitive Christian flame? Primitive Christianity is this concept of that there was a Christianity before Catholicism, say like before Constantine the Great in the 4th century, okay, before he did his bit of business, which is going to be important to what we talk about. So, when you hear somebody say primitive Christianity, that's what they're talking about. They're wondering, what is that original form of Christianity, that just came out of, say, the Council of Jerusalem and all that, right? All of which, a lot of these things talked about in the book of Acts and all this different shit, right? Okay, so I'm not going to get into that, but effectively you had, Catholicism was the church at the time, and the church even around 200 CE in that area, you had church fathers, Clement of Alexandria and a bunch of others. I mean, they are arguing back and forth. When exactly was Christ born? They didn't know, and it's ironic because we're talking about a time frame that is effectively more or less 150 years later. Okay, Jesus died at the age of 33, so if you're going off of the calendar as we understand it, okay, the common calendar if you're going off to, if you're going off the Christian calendar, let's say, how about that? If we're going off the Christian calendar, that should have been 34 AD, right? Or 34 CE? Something along those lines, or 33, right? But of course we know that actually based upon, what the Bible itself says, it could not possibly be. Like, it would end up being closer to probably 30, 31 CE that Christ died. So just, about 150 years later, nobody knows when this kid was born. I mean, that should be strange in itself, right? like that should come off as kind of odd. That this incredibly important character, the Son of God, nobody cared to say when he was actually born. I mean, shit, and he had cousins too, that you'd think they would have known. When are we celebrating your birthday, Jesus? or Yeshua, right? So, because they just didn't call him Joshua in the Greek so that they didn't confuse things. So anyway, that's interesting of itself, but understand that, yes, there was a huge argument. There was the arguments. Was it in April? Was it in January? Was it in November? Was it in May? And in fact, now, based upon a degree of astronomical evidence, the argument is that it was May. In fact, it might have been May 12th. Though one of the original arguments by Clement of Alexandria, and throughout that time, and understand, this is just when we have writings of when the arguments were happening. The arguments were probably happening long before then, otherwise they wouldn't have bothered to write about them. And so, one of the dates I think that Clement mentions is like May 20th. So, May being the time, well, maybe somebody did actually accurately pass down when Jesus was born. And maybe this is important for me to bring up here, is that, do I think Jesus was real? Yeah. I don't think he's the Son of God, but I think that there was an actual person named Jesus. I also think there was an actual person named John the Baptist who may have been a lot more important, and Jesus kind of stepped in after John the Baptist got his head lopped off. Though John the Baptist perhaps was supposed to be the actual, maybe the fruition of the Messiah, of the Messiah, the Jewish Messiah. Anyway, so... yeah, so there's a lot of debate right out of the gate as far as when exactly, when was Jesus born. Now, it's interesting to consider that a lot of the arguments, even then, over when Jesus was born, a lot of those dates fall on, various other pagan holidays that fit the bill. I mean, even like if it was the March date, they would have gotten, or maybe even some of the April dates would have gotten very close, to potentially overlapping, again, some of these celebrations around Ishtar or, other things. So you're kind of seeing right out of the gate, you're seeing that, okay, we need to choose, we really don't know the date, unless, of course, like I said, maybe the May date would have been an interesting one. The later May date, based upon astronomical evidence. Okay, but the other dates, so right away you get this sense that, yeah, the church is already thinking about how can we put Christ in the place of, a lot of these really, pagan festivals. So, anyway, I guess we could skip then, if we're already getting into that. We could skip on to when does Christmas seem to have been, formalized? When did it become a thing? Now, I don't find it ironic, I don't find it coincidence that the first recorded Christmas that we have was in the year 337 CE. And I don't find it ironic that a person died, or that it was, I'm sorry, not 337, it was 336 CE, that we have the first recorded Christmas in Rome. And that on 337 CE, Constantine the Great dies. Now, Constantine the Great is a very interesting character for a lot of reasons. He was an emperor of Rome. Of course, he went on to go found what effectively became Eastern Rome, or the Byzantine Empire. Constantinople, where do you think that name came from? Constantinople, or how does that go? Istanbul was once Constantinople, yet a long time gone. It's Constantinople, yet a Constantinople's got the... Right, They Might Be Giants. I love that song. Love that band. Bunch of Satanists, all of them. So, anyway, I don't think it's ironic that you suddenly start hearing, you start getting records of Christmas at the same time that Constantine the Great is in power. And why is this? And here's where we're going to get into a little bit of speculation, perhaps, and interpretation of history. Okay, Constantine the Great is well known. Now, he's not so held up in Catholicism, but in Eastern Orthodox Christianity, he is Saint Constantine the Great, not just Constantine the Great. He is considered a big fucking deal. In fact, they even call him in the Orthodox Church, they call him equal to the apostles. He's that important. Why? Why would a church, even though Eastern Orthodox, which is the second largest Christian group in the world, okay, first being Catholicism, then being Eastern Orthodox. Now, if you want to get into the great split that happened between those two, that's for another episode. Okay, but why would the second largest church in history, and which was originally part of the Catholic Church, openly, just there was a schism. Okay, why would they call him equal to the apostles? What did this guy do? Well, what he did was, in many ways, he codified Christianity. He codified cultural Christianity. He made Christianity the religio franca. Okay, he made it the legal religion. It is what you had to serve. It's what you had to do. Okay, so within the 4th century, during his reign, he starts, and I think most people know the story of what happened with Constantine the Great, where he was, off doing his Roman conqueror, his Roman emperor conquerorship thing. And up in the sky, he suddenly, he gets this vision and he sees Christ, and Christ is holding a sword, and Christ says, "In my name, conquer." And Constantine goes and does conquer. And he, gives the glory of the conquest to Christ. He says, "Yes, I killed all these hundreds and thousands of people in the name of Christ, because what more Christ-like thing could you do?" So, anyway, Constantine the Great, then goes on, he goes on to say, look, okay, in Rome, Christianity is the order of the day. Everybody's going to have to become Christians. You got to do this. And when he does this, suddenly all of the pagans, which is still really the most popular, and certainly by the elites, the most practiced religion. Now, paganism is a broad swath. There's so many things that fall under paganism. You have Mithraism, sons of Mithras and all this stuff, right? You have all these different religions that exist within, Rome, because Rome was a multicultural society. And it thrived because of that. It didn't fall apart. It didn't crumble. It thrived because of its multiculturalism. I know, so many of you, "Oh, no, not multiculturalism, please. What are we going to do? They're going to kill us all." No, actually, it's a great way for a culture to survive. For a society, a civilization to continue on, is by having, the checks and balances that comes with multiculturalism, along with a lot of other things. So anyway, you had a lot of these other religions that suddenly they became outlawed. They became a really big problem. Now, it was and this is where we're getting into some degree of speculation. Not that happened. Yes, he made, Constantine the Great made Christianity the religion of the empire. Okay, you had to become, effectively a Christian. But now here's where we get into some degree of speculation. Okay, from this point on. This is where some Christian faiths carry this down. A lot of your Protestant Christian faiths carry this down. Catholicism wouldn't buy into this, even though Catholicism itself Roman Catholicism does not venerate Constantine as much as, say, the Eastern Orthodox Church does. Okay, but the Protestants certainly have no love for the guy. So anyway, this is where, like I said, this is where we get into some speculation. So the theory of what happens here is that a lot of these pagans, they're kind of they're hedging their bets on eternity. Okay, now most pagans of the day worshipped on Sunday, day of the sun, day of Solus, right? Okay, nothing crazy there. That part's not speculation, but that's what they did. Now, so Jesus was Jewish, and one would argue that it's not an argument. Most of the first Christians were Jewish. And I mean, that was one of the big arguments, even within the New Testament that you have, is like, okay, how do the Greeks fit into this? And when they say Greek, they just mean Gentile, somebody that's not Jewish. How does this all, come to be? So now if you read, like, especially things from the Jerusalem Council, like you read sort of the arguments that came out of some of the chapters of the book of Acts in the New Testament. Okay, there's some arguments over like, is circumcision necessary for Christians? Is it not necessary? Like a lot of these little things that are major, not little things when it comes to Judaism, that are a major part of the Jewish faith. What parts of this apply to Christianity? And there were huge arguments around this. And so now here's speculation, is that within that, the Sabbath wouldn't have just been written off. That if you were, Sabbath, of course, being the holy day for Jews, when Jews go to synagogue, when Jews would go to their, local temples, and not that they had other temples at the time, and using the word temple, that's a whole other conversation, but that they would go to synagogue. Now, if you're a Christian, does it make sense to try to reach out to other Jews? Yes, of course, because they already know that they're waiting for a Messiah. Okay, so you're going to want to, as a Jew yourself, as a Christian, quote unquote Jew, okay, even though, at the time, Christianity was just considered a Jewish sect, so saying Christian Jew would be redundant. But regardless, if you're a Christian, you're going to want to go talk to the Jews first, because you can make easy converts out of them, because they already know. They already get it, right? Like when Paul goes to the Bereans, when the Apostle Paul goes to the Bereans and he's telling them. Now, the Bereans, of course, do their due diligence and say, okay, is everything this guy Paul is saying about this Christ, does this match up with Torah? Does, the Tanakh, well, they wouldn't have called it the Tanakh at the time, but, what you know of is the Old Testament. Does this match in with the Old Testament? And they would check it. And this is all in the New Testament. I'm not speculating here as far as based upon Christians' own recorded history, okay, and they say, okay, yep, everything you're saying about this Christ fits the bill with the Old Testament. So we, the Bereans, we are now all, we are becoming Christians with you. So people that already understood the prophecies and the stories that supposedly, Jesus fulfilled are the first people you want to reach out to. So Christians would go where? Where would Christians, congregate? When would they do worship? One would say they worshiped every day, fine, okay, but when would they do their big stuff, their big deal? When would they make sure that they got together? Well, it makes sense, especially when you have this burgeoning, a religion, that you would do it on the Sabbath, on Saturday. And, before anybody says, well, how do we know that Saturday is the Sabbath, blah, blah, blah. Okay, just fucking drop the English language. Okay, get your Americanism out of your head and go look at just about any other language, many languages which are significantly older, okay, than anything close to modern English, and see what they call Saturday on their calendars. Right, it all has something to do with Sabbath, like in Latin, it's Sabado. Saturday, Sabado. It's Sabbath. It kind of always has been. Okay. There's people get some wild arguments around that. And believe me, if you want to argue with me on it, I would love to have that conversation. You go ahead and you message me. I won't be mean. You go ahead and we'll talk about it. But anyway, so the Sabbath was something that was a part of Christian life, whether they meant to celebrate on it, or meant to have worship on it or not, however that ended up shaping up. Now, here's more of the speculation, is that when Constantine, even just then, we're talking the 300s here, okay, 4th century, all right, CE, that Constantine, when he made Christianity the religion of the empire, the legal religion, that people would have been going to church on Saturday. Easy enough. Simple enough, that's the deal. But now here's the thing. This is what I was talking about, how Romans at the time were hedging their bets on eternity. What they would do is, and I grant you there's not a ton of evidence for this, there's some, is that they would go to the Christian church on Saturday, to make sure that, well, if Jesus is offering eternal life, okay, I want a piece, and this is the legal religion, I better get a piece of that. And they'd go and they'd worship on Saturday. But then they thought to themselves, well, shit, what if they're wrong? What if the Christians are wrong? We could go worship the sun just the next day so we could attend both. And that way, we're guaranteed to go, to have eternal life. This is awesome. And so, these people that would go to Christian church on Saturday, these Romans would then go to, Day of Solstice, they'd worship the sun god on Sunday. Makes sense, right? Okay. I mean, if you're a spiritual person, sure. If you could have, if you had it's like buying 2 lottery tickets. Why the fuck wouldn't you? And so, that's the idea that would happen. Now, here's the problem is that Constantine hears about this and says, oh, no, we can't have this. You don't understand. Christianity is the fucking religion. You are going to do Christianity. I'm not even going to give you the opportunity to worship the sun god anymore. And so the theory goes, the speculation goes, is that he changed, talking to church fathers and all that Constantine the Great had the day of worship changed to Sunday. Now, I know people want to bring up some things that Paul said and that it's about, that it's the 8th day of creation, or that, Sunday was the day that the Lord rose, that Jesus rose. And so that's the day now that we celebrate. But your evidence is just as scant for that. It really, really is. So you get this appropriation that starts with Constantine, okay, is to where he appropriated Sunday. And I mean, he did, what in even some Christians' eyes is the craziest thing. He transferred the holy day. He transferred it from Saturday to Sunday. And I don't want to get into, it's like, well, what if it's, what if you're on, in a different time zone? When is it Sabbath then? Yeah, I know. Okay, give me a break. Believe me, I'm not defending the Christian faith or the Jewish faith for that matter. All right, so you get this, you theoretically have the starting of appropriation of holidays, okay, into the Christian church. And I mean, and it's not just holidays. Like, suddenly you have statues, and these are painfully obvious, and no one would even argue against it. There's statues that were originally meant to be for Venus that suddenly turn into being dedicated to the mediatrix. Mediatrix being what Catholics call, Mary, the Queen of Heaven, which, Queen of Heaven, Ishtar. No association there at all. So anyway, so you start getting this appropriation. You see it in the, the art, the statues, everything around you, and even the dates. And suddenly, Sunday becomes not the day of the sun, which is why it's fucking called Sunday, but it becomes the day of Christ, that you go and you worship Christ. But obviously, originally it wasn't. What day do you think that Christ went to church? Sunday? Nope. Obviously, he went on Sabbath. He went on the Sabbath. He went on Saturday. What would Jesus do? He'd go to church on Saturday. But anyway, and he probably wouldn't celebrate his birthday either. But so here's my point: is that why did December get chosen? Why December 25th? What's the deal here? And the argument would go is that, again, we're talking about that the first Christmas gets recorded. This first December 25th Christmas gets recorded within the lifetime. And in fact, towards the end, as Constantine became deeper and deeper into Christianity and just drove the empire crazier and crazier, that suddenly we have this celebration known as Christmas, that is replacing another very famous Roman holiday. And this is what you have to understand, is that I think it's a very simple, I don't think many people would have an issue with me saying that 100 years from now, if archaeological evidence was found for a holiday, let's say World War III happened. It's not going to happen, folks, don't worry. But let's say that it did happen, and 100, 200 years from now, people look back and they look at our buildings and they find all these different things. What holiday do you think people would walk away from, aside from April 15th? Which I think April 15th was like one of the dates that's kind of funny. Because I'm pretty sure when, When Clement of Alexandria was laying out dates available as to, when exactly can we celebrate all this shit, April 15th might have been one of the dates. Wouldn't that be something if tax day was the same as Christmas? But I'm having too much fun. No, I think it was like April 20th or something. So never mind that. Okay. So, but what holiday would people say was like really, really important to us and that we really, really venerated? I don't think it'd be a stretch to say that it was Christmas. That's what, some future archaeology team would discover. Now, if you look back to the Roman Empire or even the Roman Republic, which you have to understand that those are two very separate things. When you go back to that, what would you find? You would find constant mention of this thing called Saturnalia. It is, without a doubt, the most talked about, most written down, most mentioned holiday in Roman life, in Roman history. However, ironically, there's not a whole lot of evidence, there's some, but there's not a lot of, as much as something is mentioned and talked about, we don't exactly know how it was totally celebrated. We know bits and pieces, but we don't know everything about it. Okay, so, suddenly, my whole point in saying this is that I don't think it's a stretch that Constantine the Great would have appropriated Saturnalia and said, no, this is not Saturnalia anymore. God damn it. This is Christmas. Merry Christmas, motherfucker. And it's not a hard thing really to imagine because, it fits in very well. Saturnalia, what we do know about it, there was a lot of gift giving that went on at the time. Okay, that makes sense. Let's put in some gift giving. Well, what is Christmas, about for so many? Gift giving. Okay. Other things. You couldn't declare war. It was a time of peace. Well, everybody talks about, peace and joy. Those are two words synonymous with celebrating Christmas. They were synonymous with Saturnalia. Now, there's aspects that conflict with the larger Christian message that were a part of Saturnalia that obviously got left by the wayside. Okay, that being the orgies and a lot of the celebration and all of this, and it's understandable why that stuff would disappear. At least why it would disappear for the average person per se, and it's not unironic that a lot of the New Testament, particularly say the writings of Paul, are these very casual letters to churches saying, okay, you guys got to calm down on the sexuality. Like there's mentions in certain books, certain sections of Paul's books where, you have incest. There's all these other, kind of wild things happening, or how to treat slaves and all this different stuff. And that's not unironic either, is, kind of the message of how to treat slaves when Saturnalia itself was very much about doing a role reversal where the slaves could talk back to the masters, where the masters were brought to the level of the slave and all this stuff. And so suddenly Christianity comes in with this message of, hey, treat your slaves nicely, treat your masters nicely, blah, blah, blah. And even if your master beats you, turn the other cheek, right? A lot of the stuff is in there. If not Jesus said it, Paul certainly would get into it, in his book in the book of Romans itself and some others, right? His letters to the Corinthians. So it's interesting that, that becomes part of the message. And then, this holiday that was, or, this festival, that being Saturnalia, that was so exciting to a lot of the slaves, morphs into something else. So I think there's a lot of association. I think the argument, and we're going to get into more of this, okay, the argument that Christmas is really just Saturnalia repackaged, by a Christian emperor, by the first Christian emperor, and then just kind of passed down. I think there's so much evidence for this to be so. It's crazy. But let's talk a little bit about Saturnalia. Now, again, understand that Saturnalia has, it is an ancient holiday. And in fact, the history of Saturnalia goes far further back than just the Roman Republic. And I say Roman Republic because we know it was still celebrated there, not just in the Roman Empire. The Roman Republic this would be 500 BCE, 509 maybe, 509 BCE, that started, and then it became the Roman Empire about 500 years later. And then the Roman Empire would go on for another 1,000 maybe, depending on how you want to count it. So in the Roman Republic, this was a really big deal. It was a festival. It was about now in the name Saturn. You have Saturnalia. The name is Saturn. Okay, and Saturn is this god. Now Saturn as a god is a very, very interesting subject in itself that I could also do an entire episode on. Okay, Saturn as a god seems to be a god that goes, that has a history that keeps, we talk about crossing cultures earlier, like with Easter, Ishtar. Saturn is a god that seems to cross many, 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 many cultures. Maybe not so much in name, but he does. He does keeps crossing. So Saturn is arguably the Greek is the Roman representation of the Greek god Cronus or Kronos, right? God of time, the father of Zeus. And of course, in this case, or in the Roman case, Saturn would be, the father of Jupiter, which Jupiter is the Roman version of Zeus. And of course, if you don't know, there was a lot of, again, this appropriation that really occurs. There's a lot of this borrowing of, various mythologies and hierarchy, pantheons of gods that would get transferred from, from Egypt, or if you want to go really far back, you could say from Sumer, Akkad, Egypt, and then into Greece, and then into Rome, and blah 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 blah. It's some people want to argue just how much would get borrowed, say, from Egypt, but I think the argument stands pretty tall, because both Greece and Rome held Egypt as being like the most important segment of their empires. Like, this is where, and in fact, like Rome, or this is true in Rome, not exactly so true in Greece, but maybe not so strongly, but the hint was still there. In Rome, Egypt was effective, like the entirety of Egypt was the true, would eventually become labeled as the true home of the emperor. Okay, the whole of Egypt was considered the home of the, of the emperor, of the Caesars. And this would, in many ways be true also for, Alexander the Great. It'd be true in Greece as well. Like having, Egypt is where power came from. That was kind of the concept that you had out of that. And where did that concept come from? Well, because the gods, in many ways, came out of Egypt. Now, you run into, when you run into Saturn, and this spreads back into Greece, and it keeps going back and forth, and geography becomes a thing. But the idea is that with Saturn, I mean, Rome is founded, the Roman Republic effectively is founded by, by Romulus and Remus, who, these twins that were fed by a wolf, right? That's kind of the story that goes there. But really before much of that, and in many ways, a lot of kind of the whole of Italy and much of that area, really Saturn is seen as the person that founded all this. Saturn is this god that, that was kind of cast out. It depends on interpretation. There's a lot of different ways these stories go. But Saturn is this god that gets cast out and ends up founding, much of civilization itself. Okay, so the history of Saturn goes far, far back, even in a Roman interpretation. Okay, but, they will say, or Romans would have said, that, he kind of started in Italy, but then, again, Egypt comes into the picture, and that's really a whole other conversation, to be had there. But the bottom line is that, and this is what's really interesting, is that Saturn was in charge of things at a very unique time in human history. And this unique time is theoretical, like, I mean, it's legendary, literally, as not as in like it's legendary for, it's a legend in that it may not have existed, or maybe it did. In fact, I'm inclined to think it did. But he reigned during the Golden Age of Man. Now, the Golden Age of Man is one of the 5 ages that Hesiod talks about, who, the Greek philosopher. And Hesiod talks about the Golden Age as this time where humans just, it was the good life. humans just ate the bounty of the earth. They consumed whatever was there. I mean, some people talk about it and write about it. Some political philosophers like to write about it, and they talk about that, oh, this is when communism, that this was communism, right? Nobody owned anything and everybody was just frolicking and having a great time, blah, blah, blah. And they just ate whatever and nobody gave a shit. And it was just, that's why it's called the Golden Age, just where the whole term Golden Age comes from. Okay, it's just this, this incredible time of peace and plenty. And so Saturn ruled over that, and and arguably brought it to fruition, if you believe their mythology. So very important god, a god that is well loved, well liked, and you could understand why Saturnalia would be this thing that happens. I mean, and like I said, really, there's so much to say about Saturn. I am just scratching the surface. A lot of people talk about Saturn being the original god that anybody ever thought of or worshipped. That the Eye of Ra is actually the Eye of Saturn. I mean, there's so much history to cover there. But regardless, Saturn is heavily venerated in Rome, and so he gets his own festival. Now, here's where some things get a little bit interesting. Is that the idea of Saturnalia actually being appropriated by say the Romans or some group in that part of Europe. The claim goes and here this might shock you. The claim that Saturnalia is actually an appropriated holiday is made by the Jews in the Talmud. Now, the Talmud is a gigantic subject also, and the Talmud is this compilation, this compendium, okay, that comes together. I mean, the earliest one that still exists comes from like the 1300s, maybe. But the argument goes is that, it was probably getting written, say, around 200 CE. Also, perhaps not unironically, when there's arguments, with the church fathers in Catholicism about, hey, what are we got to start doing something about these holidays, right? So, but anyway, within that, obviously it was written before a lot of these Christian holidays became, codified in Rome and Byzantium. Because in the Talmud, there is a writing, they write about Saturnalia, that this is a thing, which is important too, because it goes to show that, you have an independent cultural witness to the existence of Saturnalia. It is not myth, okay? It is not something that, might have been a joke in history. It was something that actually happened because an entirely independent group cared to write about it. So the Talmud, to give you just a touch of history on this, now understand that there are a couple different Talmuds, okay, one of which, usually when somebody says the Talmud, they're talking about what's called the Babylonian Talmud, but there is also the Jerusalem Talmud, or what's called the Palestinian Talmud. Obviously, a lot of people don't want to call it that, because you had these two major schools at the time. You had not technically the Babylonian school, but you had the school in Jerusalem, and then you kind of had the Jewish school of thought outside of that. And the Talmud became a thing, and it was very important because what Jews were facing at that time, around 200, BC, or I'm sorry, around 200 CE. And previous to that, is that they had to deal with the fact that, their temple was destroyed, and it was. They were going around in the first couple centuries CE. The Jews were, going around. I mean, they were a people without a lot of things that they identified, that were central to their religion. And in so doing, a lot of what made up their religion, say what's called the oral law or the oral Torah being, what you know of as the Old Testament, perhaps. I know I have Jewish listeners, so, excuse me. I was going to crack a joke and say I'm speaking to the Goyim, but please. Anyway, no, I love you all. But anyway, so, you have the written Torah, okay, and then you have the oral Torah. Now, the oral Torah is a lot of this, are these interpretations, or it's an important aspect. If you don't know what the oral Torah is, the idea is that God gave to Moses on Sinai, at Mount Sinai, okay? God gave to Moses, you can have, I'm giving you the 10 Commandments, okay? Well, you're going to have the written Torah, the Levitical law and all this stuff, right? But then there will also be these things that I'm just going to tell you. or, then they're all, not just what God said per se. I mean, technically it's all what God said. But there's these things that are just going to be passed down orally, and then there's these things that are going to be written down, okay? And so this oral Torah had been supposedly, and people, I understand really? Was it really passed down all that time from Mount Sinai? 1,000, however many, 1,500 years, really? You passed these things down word for word? The oral Torah never got screwed up once? Ooh. So you have the oral Torah, which ends up after the temple gets destroyed. After the Herod's temple, the second temple gets destroyed. Suddenly Judaism is like, okay, we're not going to be able to count on being in Jerusalem. We're not going to be able to count on being in Judea itself. We are going to have to, we're going to have to start writing this stuff down. We're going to have to figure out ways to survive. And they survive by, writing all this shit down. And regardless of how accurately, if there ever was an regardless an oral Torah, regardless of all those arguments, okay, they start writing this stuff down. And they end up with what's called the Mishnah. And the Mishnah is the oral Torah written down. Yes, that is a paradox. That is an oddity. Like, how is it an oral Torah if it's written down, right? Yeah, I know. Okay. But they felt compelled to write it down, and so they do. And then, once they start writing down the oral Torah, kind of the thinking goes, or this is the theory, is that, the rabbis start saying to each other, shit, we should write down everything we're saying. And so you end up with, you have the Mishnah, which is the oral Torah that had been passed down supposedly for so many centuries. And then you end up with what's called Gemara, okay, which, or however you want to pronounce that. You end up with that, which is this new compilation of, and it's confusing as fuck because it's really just rabbis arguing back and forth, and they just wrote it all down. It's a giant opinion piece, but understand that the Talmud is just as important in Judaism, in rabbinic Judaism anyway. I know there's Karaite, I know about that. Okay, but within rabbinic Judaism, you have you have the Torah, which is the Old Testament, right, as you understand it, the books of the Bible, and then you have the Talmud, and they call it Talmud Torah, meaning that they are one. They are together. Like Torah is actually both. In fact, some people, that's why now, and this is kind of an acronym because Jews love acronyms. You call the Old Testament, the books of the Bible, you call them the Tanakh, not the Torah anymore, and that's to separate from when you're talking about the books of the Bible as compared to Mishnah or Gemara. And so you have, it's all very confusing, I know, but that's why when you say Torah, when Jews talk about the Torah, really they're not just talking about the Old Testament. So Christians can't exactly 100% relate. They would also have to read the entire Talmud, okay, to understand when a Jew says, Torah says this. So now also I'll just real quickly, I'll say there's also a concept called Midrash. Okay, or there's books, stories called Midrash, which those are like folklore for Jews. Okay, but it's a whole other aspect. It's not part of Torah. Sometimes it can guide Torah a bit, but it's not like necessarily the word of God when you start talking about Midrash. So don't confuse Midrash and Mishnah. I know they sound kind of similar, but they are two totally different things. So all right, so you have mention in the Talmud of Saturnalia. And what they argue, what the rabbis argued with Saturnalia is that actually this was really, this whole idea, well, they don't really call it Saturnalia. They actually call it Saturna. They give it a little bit of a different name. But it's still the same deal. And it's the idea of 8 days before the winter solstice, which is exactly when you would celebrate Saturnalia. Saturnalia would be celebrated on, I think it starts on December 17th or so. Or is it December 13th? Right, because it'd be 8 days. Yeah. So it starts then. And this is the thing, is that when I talk about Christmas and I crack the joke saying Happy Saturnalia, I know Saturnalia doesn't actually fall on the 25th. Okay, there is a festival that does fall on the 25th, and we'll get into that. But I say that because in my opinion, totally Saturnalia was replaced by Christmas. So the direct correlative would be to say Happy Saturnalia if you were trying to get back to the root of, where did this whole festival come from? But the Jews would tell you a different story. They would say to you that, yes, okay, there is this festival called Saturna that, would take place from like the 8 days, it would take place all the way up to the winter solstice. But then after that, here's where things get interesting. After that is a festival called Calenda. Now it's Kalenda. And that has to do with the calendars of January. But anyway, Calenda, that is in direct reference to something that supposedly Adam started celebrating. And yes, that Adam, okay, the first man. And how the story goes is that Adam noticed, this is after he's out of Eden and, he's dealing with the hardships of not being in the garden, which is the Garden of Eden, the Golden Age. Are they the same thing? Mm-hmm. But anyway, he's out of the Golden Age, shit. He's out of the Garden of Eden. There you go. No filter, folks. He's out of the Garden of Eden. He's, terrified of how potentially the world has changed, how his life has changed so drastically. And he starts to notice a very scientific principle. He starts to notice that the days are getting shorter, or the amount of daylight is getting shorter. Not that the days are actually getting shorter. And he starts to worry that this is part of the punishment. He starts freaking out. This is terrible. It's like, oh, this is because of my fall from, not fall from grace. Grace isn't really something necessarily within Judaism, but my fall from the garden. This is my fall from God. This is what this is all about. This is terrible. Holy shit, the world's going to end here very soon. But what Adam supposedly notices, is that, oh, wait a second. After December 21st, after the winter solstice, we'll say, after the winter solstice, suddenly the days get longer again. And when he realizes, Adam being this supposedly very intelligent human, the first human, he realizes that, okay, this is just how things are. This is the way that the world works. I will just plan on this. But I want to celebrate my realization of this. I want to celebrate the fact that this was not a punishment. And so Adam creates this festival that happens, that happens after that. He turns it into these 8 days of celebration. And that 8 days of celebration after the winter solstice, that's Calenda. And that's when December 25th actually fits. So you have this, and you could, the winter solstice happens when it happens, and we know that the ancient world kept a very close eye on the movements of the sun, so it's not like they'd necessarily lose track of this, but as far as like what dates exactly these things falls on, sure, you could have some argument about that, I think, before you end up with the, Julian and Gregorian calendars and all that. So that's, I love that part of the story. Because, it's effectively saying, okay, so Christmas was, the Christians that stole Christmas, the Christians that stole Saturnalia, they turned Saturnalia into Christmas, but really the Romans turned Calenda into effectively Saturnalia. And that is the argument, is that this, ancient festival, and to some credit to the Jews, and in the Talmud, is that Saturnalia, this idea of Saturnalia, so the Romans make the claim that it's a very ancient holiday. And the fact that the Jews even place it back to, oh yeah, this is something that went back all the time to, all the way to the time of Adam, gives it its antiquity, gives it this idea that it's this very, very old festival. And frankly, it makes sense for it to be a very old festival, because to ancient humans, it would be, or, maybe to more primitive humans, you could say, you want to be careful with those terms because I have some interesting ideas on a lot of those lines. But in humans of thousands of years ago, they, when the sun starts, being out more, that's a huge fucking deal, especially if one of the original, religions is worshiping the sun. So sure, it would be a very ancient thing. I think that makes tons and tons of sense, and it would be a celebration of life. It would be a celebration of, let's get stooping, let's get, it would be a celebration of renewal. It would be a celebration of a lot of these different things. Just as celebrating Ishtar in March or even April, perhaps. Celebrating that is when you are getting close to perhaps. To where the winter is going away. And so spring is coming, and it's this great fertility and all this. So a lot of these pagan festivals and holidays, they just, honestly, they make scientific sense because they would be incredibly important to humanity thousands of years ago. Just what's happening on Earth would be important to them. And so they would start to mark the days, and they would create festivals around these sorts of things. Nothing wrong with it. It doesn't even really need any supernaturalism. I think it's, I saw it quite a bit this year, actually. I loved it. I thought it was hot. I saw lots of people saying, happy winter solstice. That's worth talking about. That's worth having a day over. Well, fuck. Why not? And go ye therefore and do what they did when this shit happened. Go have your group sex and, do all the wild shit that you want. I think that's fantastic. So I don't know if I did the best job of describing a lot of this, and I'm in an hour, and so I don't want to go much further. But like I said, as far as what was actually done on Saturnalia, there was the reversal of roles. Where, again, slaves, wouldn't be necessarily punished, and that slaves and masters could eat at the same table. There was the gift giving. There were now also, and this is where things get a little fuzzy, is that it was also a time where you had gladiator contests, and that there would be, a sacrifice of some kind. It would be called the Menura, that had to do with one of Saturn's wives or consorts, that being Lua. And as far as that goes, frankly, I could see that maybe something like that happened, that would be maybe a Roman interpretation or a Roman insertion, that there needs to be kind of this blood spilt on that day, or interpretation in that it's gladiators. But it's within some of what's described about Calenda, there is sacrificing. It's not of humans necessarily, but there is a sacrifice that goes on. It's usually of some kind of animal, a lamb, ram, whatever. And also, it shouldn't be unironic that December 25th, is all about this character now, the birth of Jesus. How did Jesus die? Jesus was sacrificed. So I think, you might, if you want to think that these connections are tenuous, you are welcome to think that. But I think that there's enough there. And certainly Christmas does. The birth of Christ itself, has no historical validity. Practically none. So, if you want to talk about tenuousness, let's talk about Christ, shall we? And let's talk about when he was born, when he died isn't so much in argument because it was around Passover, but let's talk about this baby. Come on. So, yeah, certainly it wasn't all sweetness and light, but then also Christmas, kind of the central tenet of Christianity, the death of Christ and his resurrection, isn't really all sweetness and light either. It was, watch the Passion, right? The Passion of the Christ. The movie's gory, but I imagine it went about like that if it happened. It's pretty brutal. So I think a lot of this fits, but that's the thing, is that it all comes down to this kind of shifting holidays, and for really to now. I guess maybe the big question to ask out of this is that why did Constantine himself make Christianity the kind of the, like I said, the Religia Franca? Why did he make it the religion of the day? Why did he make it the religion of the empire? Now, that's a whole other question, and that's one that has a lot of speculation for it. So, but you have recorded festivals, recorded events that go back all the way, supposedly, to the time of Adam, which would have been what? So in the Jewish calendar, we're in the year 5,777, I think. 5777. Yeah, I think that's right. So that long ago, that's how long there has been something like Christmas. Before we have any recording of any kind of Christmas ever being celebrated. And you'd think, that'd be, that it wasn't celebrated. Because you have the Nicene Fathers and the Ante-Nicene Fathers, you have where they're arguing over what day is it. and I think, actually, I haven't really talked to, I have met one Christian who said, yes, Christ was born on December 25th. Most Christians I know that it's all kind of up in the air. So again, why was it picked there? Now, does that mean that, just because Constantine the Great appropriated Saturnalia and attached it here, does that mean that, Christians are doing some kind of evil thing under God because they're celebrating on that day? Well, honestly, that's up to you. But can Christians say, we're taking this festival and we're running with it? Too bad, we did it. Can you do that? Yeah, of course you can. So, but understand that, you did that, right? Like that, just like with Easter, there's other days there, even though, again, when Jesus died, there's, Good Fridays. Anyway. So there you have it. I don't think I'm going to spend much more time on this. As far as, I think I laid out, again, the amount of the information on what you actually do to celebrate Saturnalia is a little scant. You certainly want to have a good time. In fact, in many ways, honestly, it almost reminds me, except for the lack of peace part, it kind of reminds me of those terrible movies. What are they called? The Purge. Yeah, those movies that supposedly show off anarchism. Yeah, right. Well, just jizzed all over my Yeti here. But those movies, kind of talk about kind of the whole idea of those movies is that, look, everything is peaceful throughout the year, but we just got to have that one time a year where everybody can just go nuts. Well, for the Romans, that time of year was literally Saturnalia. They kind of did their own the purge. Again, it's arguable whether or not that's how it was exactly celebrated, what went on, and blah, blah, blah. Lovemaking was certainly a big part of it. There was the gift giving that we know was a part of it. There's certain parts of it that we are aware of, but there's other parts. And it's ironic, too, because, again, it is the most well-known Roman holiday, ancient Roman holiday. But yeah, one could argue that it's something like that. But of course, it's super clear that it was supposed to be a time where you could not declare war. It was supposed to be absolutely a time of peace. Why they couldn't just fucking extend that across the board? Well, of course, legally, I wouldn't want anybody to do that. But why not just say, hey, how about we have Saturnalia every day? Especially if it's supposed to be representative, like we said, of the god Saturn, and Saturn ruled over the Golden Age. Let's just turn everything into a fucking Golden Age, right? Well, maybe economics had a thing or two with that, but doesn't mean it might not be possible in the future. I wonder. Anyway, there you go. That's it. There's our exploration of Christianity, Saturnalia, calendar. And if I mispronounced anything in any of this, a lot of it I've just read because some of it's not sexy enough to get a documentary. So there you have it. Anyway, enough of that. I could talk forever, really, about this subject, but I think I'm going to go have some dinner. So, Merry Calendar. It would still fall under calendar right now, and I'll see you on the other side.
You just experienced Sovereign Tech. Go to sovereigntech.com, that's SOVRYN tech.com, and connect with us there. Find links from today's show and catch our podcast feed. Sovereign Tech is copy heart. Copying art is an act of love, and love is not subject to law. So please share the show however you like. Welcome to the evolution.
Bye.